Here we go, the third and final episode of the Books I Have Skimmed retrospective of the Compendium Maleficarum, Book 1. If all goes as planned, I will have a much shorter version of that title in the bit underneath the video there. Fingers crossed. Anyway, onto the book. Chapter 13, Whether Witches Can Transmute Bodies from One Form to Another. No one can doubt that all the arts and metamorphoses by which witches change men into beasts are deceptive illusions and opposed to all nature. I add that anyone who holds the contrary opinion is in danger of anathema. And this is one of my absolute favourite witchcraft facts, that believing a witch can change a person into an animal is a bigger crime in the eyes of the church than being a witch in the first place. They hold that only God can change the fundamental nature of a thing, so if you're being a witch and doing all Satan-y things, at least you're doing bad things that the church believes in. If you're saying that witches can turn things into things, then you are denying the church, and they do not like that at all. This does of course mean that Salem was the most heretical part of Sabrina the Teenage Witch. I'm sure he'd be pleased to know that. Speaking of talking animals, but remembering that Salem wasn't just a talking cat, he was a witch sentenced to 100 years being transformed into a house pet for a failed revolution attempting to take over the world, we come to the next chapter, where the witches have the power to make beasts talk. At times it happens that God grants the power of speech to that which naturally has no such power, as is the case of Balaam's ass in Holy Scripture. But how this may be, none knows but he who is the author of all speech. But I think for the most part it is the voice of an angel speaking in such inanimate objects or brutes. Let's just go back a moment. He's made a number of I think statements throughout this book. If this was an essay, I would be forced to fail him for that. As for brute animals, speech is created in their own bodies and is a physical action of the beast itself, yet such action is intellectual only on the part of the angel. This is true of such animals that have organs adapted to speech, such as magpies, parrots, ravens and the like. This is clearly written by someone who's never heard a parrot speak. In the examples, we read in 1546, Margarita of Essling had pains in her belly, and that it swelled to such a size to completely hide her face, being more than 10 palms in circumference. Those who stood about her bed heard the crowing of cocks, the clucking of hens, the braying of asses, the barking of dogs, the bleating of sheep, the grunting of pigs, the lowing of oxen, and the neighing of horses. Then she voided from her side about 150 worms and serpents. This was believed to be a miracle, but it was, in truth, only a devil's illusion created by the girl's mother for the sake of gain. So on the one hand, weird story, well done, but on the other, that doesn't have anything to do with the point of if witches have the power to make beasts talk. That's about a girl full of worms. Oh well. Chapter 15, Whether the Devil Can Make Men Insensible to Torture. And of course, of bloody course, because if you torture someone and they still won't confess to being a witch, that just means they're very, very a witch. And the examples are equally loopy. A certain law student named Quirino, a bachelor of law, who, relying on such a charm, boldly mingled in brawls and fights, and though often struck was never wounded. At last, in 1572 or 1573, he was killed at a drinking bout in Rome, through some trifling wound. So this is about someone who knew a magic spell that made them invincible except for when it didn't. Great. Similarly, in the next story, there was a notorious witch named Scavius, who dared to boast publicly that whenever he wished he could change himself into a mouse in the sight of all his rivals, and so he is said to have often escaped from the hands of his mortal enemies. But when it was the will of divine justice to make an end of his wickedness, his enemies stole upon him while he was sitting in a warm bath by the window, suspecting no attack, and suddenly struck him through the window with swords and spears, so that he perished miserably for his crimes. And again later on, at Brindisi in November 1590, when Claudia Bogata was about to be tortured, she was closely shaved as the custom is, and so a scar was exposed at the top of her bare brow. The Inquisitor, then suspecting the truth, namely that it was a mark made by the devil's claw, which had before been hidden by her hair, ordered a pin to be thrust deep into it, and when this was done she neither felt any pain nor did so much as a drop of blood come from the wound, yet she persisted in denying the truth, saying that her insensitiveness was caused by an old blow from a stone. But when she was brought to the torture, she not only acknowledged that the scar had been given to her by the devil, but confessed to many other abominable crimes which she had committed. So that's 3 stories now about people with magic spells making them immune to death and torture that don't actually work. You've got to respect the mental gymnastics required to accept these stories as proof of how dangerous witchcraft is. Wait, no, not respect, what's the other one? What's it called again? Oh yeah, fuck these guys. It's surprising how easy those two are to confuse with each other. I mean, look at Netflix. They accidentally released a whole series about how great Ted Bundy was. Whoopsie daisy. And then chapter 16, Whether by witchcraft and devil's work the sexes can be interchanged, there is some surprised trans representation. Cornelius Gemma inquires into the mutation of the feminine into the masculine sex and the masculine into the feminine, which is admitted by modern physicians to be natural. And there are plenty of examples, all of them, of women suddenly growing penises. In the town of Esguerra in Portugal, about 9 leagues from Coimbra, there lived a nobleman who had a daughter named Maria Pacheco. When this girl was at the age when a woman's monthly courses usually begin, instead of a fluid excretion there broke or otherwise grew from those parts a virile member. And so, from being a girl, she suddenly became a public young man endowed with virility, and assumed the name of Manuel Pacheco. He then took ship for India, and endured much hardship and performed great deeds as a soldier. Returning to his country, he married a noble wife, yet Amatus the Portuguese, writing in his Centuries, makes no mention of any children, but says that he remained unbearded and with a feminine cast of countenance, these being indications of imperfect virility. And the language and the intent behind it might not all be perfect. The fact that even this ghastly priest writing at the start of the 17th century manages to get the pronouns right means there might be hope for us all yet. The next chapter, chapter 17, Whether the Spirits of the Dead Can Appear to Men, gives us the most boring 14 pages of ghost stories I've ever read. Let's skip past these. But then chapter 18, of Apparitions of Demons or Spectres, shows just how Scientology crazy these people were. It must be known that there are many different kinds of demons, differing among themselves by fixed degrees. The first kind is fiery, for they dwell in the upper air and will never sink to the lower regions until the day of judgment, and these have no dealings on earth with men. The second is the aerial, for they dwell in the air around us. These can descend to hell, and by assuming bodies formed of the denser air can appear at times to men. More often, with the permission of God, they disturb the air and raise thunders and tempests, and they all conspire together for the ruin of the human race. Thanks God! The third sort is terrestrial, and we may not doubt that these were cast from heaven upon earth for their sins. Some of these devils dwell in woods and forests and lay snares for hunters. Some dwell in the fields and lead nightfarers astray, others dwell in hidden places and caverns, while others delight to live in secret with men. A fourth sort is of the water, for they dwell underwater in rivers and lakes, and are full of wrath, turbulent, unquiet, and fraudulent. They rise up storms at sea, sink ships in the deep, and destroy life in the waters. When such demons appear, they are more often women than men, for they live in humid places, and lead a softer manner of life. But those which live in drier, harder places usually appear as men. The fifth sort is subterranean, for they live in caves and caverns in the mountains. These demons are of the worst disposition, and chiefly molest those who dig pits or mines and look for treasure in the earth, and they are ever ready to harm the human race. They cause earthquakes and winds and fires, and shake the foundations of houses. The sixth sort is called Lucifergus, because they chiefly abhor and detest the light and can never appear by day, nor can they assume a bodily form except at night. This kind of demons is altogether inscrutable, and of a nature beyond human understanding, being all dark within and shaken with icy passions, malicious, restless and perturbed. And when they meet men at night they violently oppress them, and, with the permission of God, often kill them by some breath or touch. Thanks God! Of this sort, perhaps, was that Asmodeus of whom we have read in the story of Tobias. This kind of demons has no dealings with witches, neither can they be kept away by incantations, for they shun the light, and the voices of men and every sort of noise. I don't know why, in this last paragraph, the singular form of demons is given twice as demons. Is it some kind of irregular noun that I've never known that about, or is it just the same typo twice? I guess we'll never know. Anyway, the examples. A certain waggoner from Nancy was in a fenny copse on the outside of the town of Nancy cutting wood, when a fierce storm suddenly arose. He made haste towards a cottage to find shelter, and on the way he rested under a thick, wide-spreading tree, and waited for the storm to abate. There he was surprised to see standing near him another woodman, and when he looked at him more closely, as we do when we meet a stranger, he saw that his nose kept shooting out to the length of a stick, and then quickly contracting back to its former shape and size, that his feet were cloven hooves, and that his whole body was of immoderate size. He was struck nearly dead with sheer terror at this, and then, as is the Christian custom in difficulties, made the sign of the cross, after which he found himself alone as before. But he remained so stupefied by his experience, though he was used to say that he could find his way around Nancy blindfolded, now he could not do so even with the most diligent attention, but came to that city with his tongue sticking and his eyes staring, and so trembling all over that it was easy to believe what he said had happened. And it's good to know that that's how low the bar lies for research in this book. I just like that at first glance he happened to know that this other person was a woodman, and it wasn't until he looked again that he realised that they were huge and goat-legged and had a shooty out nose. Still, at least no one got tortured for this. More of this story, please. At Salamanca, there was a matron whose house was popularly said to be haunted by stone throwing. The mayor of the city was incited by this rumour to test for himself whether the persistent rumour concerning that house was true, or whether it was not rather invented by the servants in order to cover some naughty pranks of theirs, for there were among them 2 young girls of no mean beauty, and it was suspected that the whole of this story had been fabricated in order to facilitate their meetings with their lovers. So the mayor went to the house at the time when the stoning was said to be most frequent, and there went with him no less than 20 of the townsmen, some of whom he sent with a light to search the upper part of the house to see who it was who threw stones at the servants. They searched diligently everywhere, and came back and said they had found nothing at all alarming. He then decided to examine the cellars, to which some steps led down from the dining room, and to spend some time in a further search in that direction. And lo! Hardly had they reached the place before there was a great noise, and stones began to be hurled at them and swept them off their legs, but without harming them. So they were sent again to see where the shower of stones came from, and although they found no one in the place, the shower of stones kept falling. This went far to confirm the opinion which many had formed, that the phenomena were all due to the devil's work and magic, and this belief they more stoutly maintained as the stones kept falling about their heads. Some of them there rushed out of the house in terror, but one of them, feeling bolder at a safe distance, took up and carefully noted the appearance of one particular stone. Or should that be, feeling a boulder? Do you get it? Because... never mind. And threw it into the house, saying, "If this came from you, O demon, throw this same stone back at me." And when this was at once done, there was no more room for doubt that the house was haunted by demons, as the matron had said. So is this what the demons do when God won't permit them to exterminate all life on Earth? They lob stones at people, without hurting them, to facilitate some pretty young girls getting their end away with their lovers. Well, I suppose it's less petty than the angels, whose whole job is to do the voice of parrots. We'll skip past a whole load of anti-Semitic stories, but we will touch on the fact that, briefly here, the devil does use a pitchfork. It's always nice to rely on the classics. Until we come to chapter 19, that cacodemons exercise their magic powers of their own will, which explains that the only way people can have any control over demons is by the grace of God, and the only way to do that is via an exorcism. Any witch that claims she's working with the demon is only pretending to work for her. And at least this chapter has some mild logic to its reasoning, that the only way we would be able to control demons is if they taught us how to do it, and they would not do that. Francesco Guazzo says a lot of nasty things about demons, but he doesn't think they're thick. The examples here are pretty good though. 2 magicians met in the hall of the Queen of England to give an entertainment, having mutually agreed to obey each other implicitly. The first ordered the second to look out of the window. When he had done so, Stag's horns grew from his head, and he was for a long time exposed to the ridicule and jokes of all. So, since he had been powerless under this outrage, and wished to avenge himself with a worse one, he drew a human figure with charcoal on the wall, and ordered the first sorcerer to stand under that figure, and to walk through the wall. The first magician saw instant death in this, and was afraid and began to beg to be excused, but when the other reminded him of their agreement, he was compelled to obey. And he was seen to walk through the wall, but he was never found afterwards, for the demon with his higher power had killed him and hidden his body in some deserted place or cave. I will give another example taken from a certain German jurisconsult. A conjurer, a man of high estate, for the public amusement and at the request of his fellow guests, cut off the head of his host's servant. But when he wanted to restore the head to him, he found that there was another sorcerer who was preventing this. He asked the man not to do so, but when, after many warnings, he still persisted, the first conjurer caused a lily to grow on the table, and no sooner had he cut off its head and leaves, that the second sorcerer who had been thwarting him fell headless from the table, and the conjurer replaced the head upon the servant with no difficulty. Having done this, he immediately fled from the house and city, lest he should be taken by the magistrate for murder. This pretended cutting off the head and its restoration, as well as the production and cutting off of the lily, must all be ascribed to magical illusion. There was a contest between the demons of the 2 sorcerers, and the weaker of them was strong enough to hinder the success of the glamour, but was compelled by the stronger, though not unwillingly, I think, to agree to his client's death, which was a matter of fact and no illusion. And time for one more story before I wrap up this episode. Wenceslas, the Emperor and King of the Bohemians, formed an alliance with Prince John of Bavaria by marrying his daughter Sophia. No, not the good King Wenceslas from the song. That was Wenceslas I. This is Wenceslas III, his great-grandson. Do keep up. And since the prince knew that his son-in-law took delight in ludicrous shows and magical illusions, he took a wagon full of buffoons and conjurers to Prague. There, the most skilled of the conjurers was giving an exhibition of his power to deceive the eyes, when there came among the spectators Zaito, the magician of Wenceslas, with his mouth stretched open to his ears. He came near and ate up that Bavarian conjurer with all his apparatus except his shoes, which he spat out because they were muddy. He then retired to rid his belly of its unwanted burden, and voided it in a tub full of water, and thus he restored the dripping conjurer to be laughed at on all sides by spectators. After this, his companions also stopped their tricks. Now, that eating of the conjurer was mere illusion, but the wretched man was really snatched up and thrown into the tub of water by a demon, and was not voided through the other's bowels. You know, it's funny how when it's men doing this at the behest of royalty, it's a lot less sinful than when women do it out in the countryside. Wait, no, not funny. The other thing, you know, what's it called? Anyway, that brings us to the end of the first of the 3 books. At some point I'd like to come back to this and cover the other 2 books, but it's surprisingly difficult to make jokes about. It's like doing satire of modern politics. The bits that are grim are just too grim to laugh at, and the bits that are absurd are so obviously absurd you don't need to say any more funny things about them. But if you do want me to hurry up and cover the other 2 books soon, do let me know. Next time, something jollier, I think. Children's book, maybe. I'll see what I've got on the shelf. Take care.